the line. Still so much to learn.
Hey guys, today I'm going to be talking about my Chaos Bolt Lich and why it's better played on Lich instead of Warlock, and kind of going to be talking about the build in general. So this build revolves around the actual hits of Chaos Bolt and not using them as a secondary to do other things that some other builds use. And so there's a couple things about Chaos Bolt that you have to consider with this. The first thing is that it has impressively low damage. Like it only scales with 100% effective damage for each individual bolt. And in terms of raw hit damage, there's not a whole lot comparatively to other skills on this tree. So you've got some damage here and some damage here, and roughly it equates to about ×2 damage, depending on whether these mods, the stat lines that are on this one are multiplicative with each other and this one multiplicative with each other. It's somewhere between almost ×2 damage and a little over ×2 damage. So roughly speaking, it's a little double damage. And I'm not sure whether this cast speed is multiplicative or not. Usually cast speed built into trees is multiplicative. However, could be different. So mostly, the thing that is impressive is the number of hits per second you can reach with Chaos Bolts. And that's mostly due to the fact that it fires 3 bolts on its own, and you can scale that up to 7, but you drastically increase its mana cost. I have tested around with +7, but unfortunately it just drains way too much mana to warrant doing. It feels really good for clearing, because this node that gives you mana when you can hit more enemies turns out is really good. But when you can only hit a single target, then your mana really suffers. And so I removed a point, I placed it into the cast speed here for a little bit of extra damage. Other than that, the tree is got actually a lot of really good things in it. So first off, we can proc Rip Blood. And we'll talk a little bit about this later, but this is part of why we scale so much intelligence, is because there's a lot of intelligence scaling with Rip Blood that works really well, and this is one of them. We can also proc Harvest, which is the main reason why we get to about 20-25 dex with this build. You want to get to that point so you can proc Harvest frequently enough, but you don't want to go too much past that because there's no other scaling from dex with this build. Other than that, you just get a little bit of AoE. You get reduced target area, so the cluster of projectiles are closer together, meaning they can shotgun more easily. That's actually the bigger part of this node than the base crit. And then we go over here for reasons I'll explain in just a minute, which takes us to this node. This is actually the most damage we can get. And so we want to get as much of these ailments on enemies as possible. We have to inflict Damned, Ignited, Bleeding, and Frostbitten. And the most difficult one is actually Frostbite. And there's really only 4 options in this build. There's a set relic that gives Frostbite, but unfortunately Twisted Heart is just way too good for this build, so you can't use that. There's also Snowdrift Boots, which gives some Frostbite chance, but Again, the boot slot is a highly competitive thing in this game, especially with how much movement speed, and now with new Citadel boots giving you crit reduction, it's pretty competitive to swap out boots, so that becomes significantly harder. And there's also the blessing. There's a blessing that gives you a chance to have frostbite here from Age of Winter. And I was running this for a while, but I decided to run the armor blessing because I realized you can convert your ignite chance with Chaos Bolt specifically into frostbite and solve that problem. And then you can take this node, which is just one adjacent, one more point, which basically gives you 6% double damage, so it's even more damage. And that's the basics of the tree. There's a lot of really good nodes in the tree that make this sustainable to use for hit-based. But the problem with that is, though, that the damage numbers look very low. But you have to consider how many times you're hitting per second with your main skill, which for us is pretty close to 15. So it kind of leaves us with talking about other skills, which we'll get to Rip Blood here. Rip Blood is mostly a utility skill. So Rip Blood is used just to get hits in to proc ailments and to give us a ward. And so we go here for double splatter. If you have a 200% splatter chance, you can have 2 splatters, which just means more hits, essentially. And we get the AoE instead of like damage or other things here, just because it hits packs easier and proliferates your ailments better. The main reason, though, that we want to get as many hits in as possible with Rip Blood and a little bit with Harvest is because we no longer have Ignite chance with this node with Chaos Bolt, so we no longer would benefit from the Ignite hit damage unless we found another way to proc Ignites. And then lastly, with Rip Blood, you need to make sure that you convert your health gain to ward. Now, the ward from this is comparable to putting on a Twisted Heart itself. It is absolutely ridiculous when you scale intelligence. And the reason is because Rip Blood gives you 10 health baseline without being specialized. So when the Blood Orb reaches you, you heal for 10 health. You can scale it up with 5 points here to 30, and then you convert it to ward. So you get 30 ward, but you get 5% increase per point of intelligence. And you can scale over 100 intelligence, but you can definitely push 120 if you really want to. But with 100 intelligence, it's times 6. So it's 30 times 6. That's 100 ward per second. And the rate limit that we can proc Rip Blood is 2 times per second. That means that this is roughly 400 ward per second when you scale more than 100 intelligence. It is pretty insane how competitive Rip Blood can be for just ward scaling as a skill specialty slot. And then you kind of have Harvest. Now, Harvest has actually a lot in this build. So one of the biggest things in high corruption is this node. Essentially, bosses become a giant life bar with the new corruption scaling. And so we just want to end the fight faster, and killing them instantly when they reach 12% is pretty nice. Aside from that, you can get some Necrotic Shred here, which is really helpful. The area here is kind of nice, but it's not huge. If I didn't have to put points to travel, I wouldn't put them in here. The base crit here is pretty important, but you don't need to put 3 points in here. The only reason it's important is because you need to land a crit for this node to work, and you need to have landed a crit for this node to work. And so if you've landed a crit in the past 4 seconds with Harvest, which you will pretty much all the time, you'll have another 50% increased global crit chance. And then you'll have 20% movement speed, which is nice for moving around, but also nice because of the weapon that we're using. And then your next most important skill is Reaper Form. And Reaper Form is still really good in this game. There's a lot of problems with it, which I'm not really going to talk about, but usually the trees for Reaper Form are pretty standard. Usually you want to grab some armor, and since we're scaling a lot of this node, putting 4 points into it is pretty good, especially with the amount of tank that you need to build in late corruption. And then it's just about getting as much damage as you can. So usually that means getting crit multi here, getting a little bit of flat here. And then this does give you some damage, but it's not really that good. This is really where a lot of the damage scaling is for Reaper Form, and this is 100% increased global damage and 100% increased global crit. Now, the health lost on kill to people who haven't played with Reaper Form does look a little scary, but you have so much leech with this build, it just doesn't matter. And the 4 points here are pretty important. They just help you sustain Reaper Form. Because the idea with Reaper Form is that you can stay in it as long as you have health, and the longer you've been in Reaper Form, the faster your health decays. And so slowing that decay doesn't make it so that we can permanently sustain it, but it makes it so that we can sustain it for a longer time. That's very important. And then lastly, we have Transplant. A lot of builds that use Transplant actually don't specialize into it because there's just other skills. You're proccing some skills, and then Transplant gets kind of left to the side. Transplant is pretty good with this build. We can get it to proc Rip Blood when we teleport, so we can gain a little bit of ward when we teleport, so it's not like we're losing a whole lot of ward because we're not casting our skills. But the build is pretty mana thirsty, so we can get mana on teleport, and because of our movement speed, the cooldown doesn't really hurt all that much, the extra cooldown we get. And then after that, it's just about trying to get as much tank as possible out of it, and so that's grabbing Bone Armor. Now, Bone Armor has a 10-second cooldown, but it gives us 300 base armor, scaled up 20%, so that's 360 base armor, and then less damage taken, which goes up to 14-15% with the increased effect here. And we can extend its 4-second duration to 7 seconds. So if you play really well, you can have this up for 7 out of 10 seconds, but that's usually not going to happen. So you're probably going to have this up maybe 50% of the time. Either way, though, it is a huge layer of defense, and you can definitely feel when you don't have bone armor. There are a couple other skills you can specialize in, but these are the things that I've found to be the most effective. Now, as far as skill points go, Lich becomes a lot more convincing over Warlock for hit-based Chaos Bolts, primarily because of crit scaling. If you look at the Warlock tree, the only crit scaling you have comes from this. Well, you get double damage here, which is reasonably effective, but it's basically this. You get maybe, 70% critical strike multiplier, but you have no critical strike chance. The only other redeeming factor is that you have more damage per negative ailment on you, which this can be abusable in a way. You can use the self-ignite belt and marinas to constantly apply ignites and dams to yourself, and then maybe even add in a bleeding heart to apply bleeds to you all the time. And you might be able to maintain 40 negative ailments on you. So with 5 points, this is 20% more damage. But there's not really a reasonable thing after that to be able to use this tree, because this is mostly a dot-based mastery. That moves us over to Lich. And it turns out Lich is pretty good for this. So the first thing that we have to realize is that Chaos Bolts takes a lot of mana to cast. So in the high end, if you have 7 projectiles, it costs 27 mana per cast, and you usually want to reach about 2.5 casts per second to feel comfortable. So that can be 60 to 70 mana per second that you're using. That is it's a pretty intense cost. So we have to find ways to deal with that. And so on our passive tree, we take every single mana regen point that we can because it is super important. So we grab all 8 points here. We grab all 10 points here. This is pretty good too because we can scale int here. So as you see here, the rest of the nodes that we have in Warlock are basically just about getting ailments here. So this gives us basically all of our damn chance comes from 3 points here. The earlier you are in your character's progression, the better it is to have more points into Chaos Flames here. But eventually you decide to start dropping them because you don't really need the damage from them, and your hit rate increases as your budget increases. So you're able to kind of get away with having a lower ailment chance because you shit out so many projectiles with this build. So I decided to opt in for armor here. And then lastly, we want maximum mana from Warlock because we scale a lot of intelligence. So having an extra 100 maximum mana actually does feel pretty good. So with Lich, the tree is pretty cookie cutter. Most Lich trees you can expect to be somewhat similar for hit-based builds. The main difference, though, is that we're grabbing bleed chance here, and that's simply because of our ailment damage requirement. A lot of the damage in this tree is conditional on enemies being debuffed, so there's 4 different ailments you have to find and find a source for this node to work. And then you have to have things cursed for this node to have an extra effect. There's 5 different ailments that you really have to solve. So the easiest way to get bleed is from this node here. We talked about damned from this node. We talked about frostbite and where we're getting that from. So essentially, the last ailment is ignite. And ignite is a little tricky because we have converted a lot of our ignite using this node into all of it, actually, for chaos bolts. And the problem is, if you take a look at the wording on this node here, it says ignite chance specifically with fire skills. And when we convert chaos bolts from fire to cold, it's no longer a fire skill. So it no longer gains this, but even if it did gain it, it would be converted to frostbite. The only way that we can get ignite on an enemy is by proccing it with Rip Blood or with Harvest. So what you need to do is you need to get global ignite either from your wand or from an idol. I have 2 idols here. 20% chance is about where it feels good. That's where I realize I don't need any more ignite. Otherwise, there might be some weird shenanigans you have to pull off to get ignite, but anyway. The rest of the tree, though, is basically just int, int, and int. At the same time, you're grabbing crit here. These crit nodes are really big. This is really the deciding factor for me to go with Lich is the increased critical strike here and the increased critical strike you get from Reperform. It's 200% that you don't have if you play Warlock. It's pretty huge. Additionally, you can get some flat necrotic here. A lot of spells really need to scale base damage, and this is one of them. So getting base damage is pretty significant. And then it's basically just about getting a lot of leech. So you get leech here, you get some leech here, and some movement speed, and then you get some leech here. And you have native leech for being a lich. So once you get into a map, your very low health will fill right up as soon as you hit something. And if you're really afraid, you can drain your potions to be full health for a second until you can get a little bit of damage in and leech back up to full. So after that, it's basically about gear. Now, a lot of my gear is really scary high budget, but you can really level with this build. I started leveling this build as soon as I unlocked Chaos Bolts, and I've been playing that skill all the way from about level 25 to 30 or to 100. So it's definitely a viable leveling build. But what you really need to find is a source of curse on hit with Marked for Death, and there's really 2 in the game. The first one are these gloves. These are best in slot for the build, even over crazy rares. It's usually pretty cheap to get 1 LP on these. We'll talk about that later. Basically, these give health, a little bit of mana regen, and they give a chance to apply Marked for Death on hit. And that becomes very crucial for really 2 reasons. Marked for Death itself applies damage, as well as you get extra damage against Cursed here. So you just deal a lot more damage, like 40-50% more damage to cursed enemies. But there's a stipulation with this node here that the enemies have to be cursed for you to gain mana, and this is about half of your mana sustain here is coming from this node, so it is nothing to scoff at. Now fortunately, if you're playing in an SSF environment or you're just too poor to afford these gloves, don't worry, there's an alternative. It's a little weaker, but you can put 3 points here in Reaper form. You can sacrifice them from armor, from crit multi, from some of the flat damage here too. And you can put 3 points here. And essentially this gives you a lower but definitely significant chance to apply Marked for Death on hit. It's about a 15% chance with all hits. And with the number of hits per second you can reach in general with this build, which is north of 20, you're pretty much going to proc this after about half a second of fighting an enemy. It's really fast. So that's really the first upgrade you want to get, is something like this. The next item is actually Twisted Heart, and that is because it is undisputed best in slot for this build. There is no other relic that can come close to this. Not even the most crazy quad tier 7 rare can beat this. And it's really because on the implicit you have increased health, which is just almost globally good on all characters, except for maybe Vessel of Strife builds. And then you have +1 necrotic skills, +1 elemental, and then you have the massive ward generation. You have cast speed and strength. All of these stats, even the strength, are really good for this build. The first thing you have to realize is that Chaos Bolt has both a necrotic tag and a cold tag, or fire if you haven't converted it to cold. Either way, it classifies as both necrotic and elemental, so you get +2 to Chaos Bolts with Twisted Heart, as well as you gain 16% of your health converted to ward. This is as powerful as Twisted Heart was before it was nerfed the first time back in beta 0.9. This is really, really crazy strong with the build. And lastly, cast speed and strength. These are the two weaker stats on it. And really the strength is just for armor scaling. Armor is pretty huge in this game. It makes a massive difference. So with almost 25 strength, I'm getting almost double the armor from the strength, because you get 4% per point of strength. So we're at about 96% increased strength, which is just massive. And a lot of that is Twisted Heart giving us 15. And then it's basically just budget rares or exalteds. And so this really what you're looking for after that is just a wand. Now, after you get a decent rare, there's two uniques that are good for this build. There's Marina's Lost Soul, which I have a couple here. So Marina's, it's a pretty decent option. It's got like maybe up to almost 30 extra flat damage on it. It's got increased spell damage and cast speed. However, Wrong Warp is way too good in this game. It has way more damage. And the reason it has more damage is because the second to last line, 3% increased spell damage per 1% movement speed. This is so incredibly good, even if you're only at 80 movement speed, that it's unbelievable. This character is able to get almost to 150% movement speed, which is part of why we decide to specialize into Harvest instead of Death Seal, because you can get the movement speed here, which this node is not only giving you movement speed, but it's giving you 60% increased damage because of Wrong Warp. That's a huge node here. The other problem with Marinas essentially comes down to the reduced health, the lack of flat mana, and it's got a little bit less cast speed, and it also applies a debuff to you when you cast a spell, which the debuff is not a huge deal in late game, but it's still something. The only issue with Wrong Warp is the cast speed is conditional on teleporting in the last 10 seconds. You can see you have to maintain this Chrono Warp buff, but the 1 second of immunity and the stun that it applies to nearby enemies when you use your transplant is pretty huge, and honestly is a crazy layer of defense and high corruption. Super underrated. Now, for rings, you don't need red rings. These are just something if you're going to push really high corruption that become almost mandatory for the build. But they're really just flex items. You can actually get way more damage out of any rare. You just use something like a copper ring for critical strike chance, and you just get damage mods, crit chance, spell damage, even necrotic damage, although that's not quite as good. Intelligence is definitely something you can grab here. Really, the reason we're using red rings is they have almost everything we would want on them. They have a little bit of damage because the attributes does provide a bit of damage. It has all resistance, so with the base type of this body armor and 2 red rings, you're basically going to be floating around 50-60 all resistance right there, which is basically just 1 roll for each resistance on gear and maybe like some idols here and there, and you're capped on all resistance types. The all attributes here becomes really nice when you consider the fact that it provides you dex so that you can proc harvest faster, a little bit of life, and strength for armor. And then you have the 10% less damage taken if you have at least 180 total attributes. I have exactly 180. So with 2 of these, it becomes, well, I don't know if it's multiplicative or additive with each other, but 19 or 20% less damage taken, which is pretty significant in higher corruption. And lastly, like I said, we scale with movement speed, so having a movement speed implicit is nice. It's not a huge damage modifier, but it's definitely something that they provide. The rest of the gear is pretty cookie cutter. You want decent boots. Citadel boots are the only base you can actually use in the really late game. These aren't the craziest boots in the world, but they're pretty good. It's cookie cutter stats. It's armor with crit reduction, int, movement speed, and life. Basically all you want on boots. Belt. Belt is pretty solved in what you want. You have to have mana regen. Anywhere that you can roll mana regen, you have to have it because the build is so mana thirsty. And so that includes the belt. Then it basically just becomes mana regen with double health. And then you do want to try and get the experimented mana on potion use because that does provide another small but noticeable amount of mana recovery. And chest, I mean, this is super easy to get except for the sealed mod. Ideally, you'd want to have +2 to reperform, but that's not exactly the way this chest was going to craft, so... health, armor, and attributes. You want to make sure that you're above at least 20 dexterity. That's where it starts to feel comfortable. 25 is where it feels really good. You definitely don't want to push much past 25 dex. So sealed or exalted intelligence is usually the better option here, but this is just what I got. Helmet, this is very, I guess I could say solved too. There's really 2 or 3 theories with base types. The Raven Crown is what I found to be the better of the 3. And that's basically just because the flat damage is around a 10 to 15% more damage multiplier for the build. It is actually pretty crazy. The mods you're looking for are exactly this, except for maybe dodge. Dodge is like a flex thing that I'm trying to scale. You're probably better off just getting armor or even more health, but it's just something I've tried and works out okay, but dodge is not exactly in the greatest state in this game, so you don't have to go for it. But the 2 mods you have to have here in the late game are at least tier 6 level of Chaos Bolts and chance to proc additional bolts, because that's effectively 50% more damage when you proc it, as well as the fact that when they hit enemies, you stack your ailments faster, and you can also get more mana back from the mana on hit node Chaos Bolts. Now, the other theories that I have anyway for base types are, if I can find some here, my stash is completely disorganized. So there's Coven Hat. And the idea behind Coven Hat is just the mana regen. I don't think the mana regen really pays enough for the damage that you lose by not having a Raven Crown. The other base type, if I even have one here, is Profane Crown. And the idea here is to scale as much area for area skills as possible so that your projectiles have greater overlap. That's really all it is. And I still don't think this is as good as Raven Crown. So if you want to experiment with those, you absolutely can. And like most casters, we go with a Crystal Skull because 6 base crit is a huge amount, and this build does kind of have a difficult time scaling critical strike chance. Right now, I'm only at about an 80% chance, and that is with this recent addition to my build with this Twisted Heart. So if you don't have a Twisted Heart like this, you're going to be at around a 60-50% chance or something, which is good enough, but it's obviously if you can push to 90 or 100% crit, you're going to almost double your damage doing that. The rest of the stats are same thing you would expect on any Crystal Skull, just crit, and spell damage. The side note here is that int is pretty good for the build, so you do want to try and get as high of an int roll as you can, but the base crit roll is the most important on the implicit. You want to get that at least 5, but definitely 6 when you can. The amulet is the only remaining slot. This is a pretty good amulet if you want to scale dodge. Like I said, you're probably better off scaling health and armor. So you definitely want either a crit mod, crit chance or crit multi, and mana regen, and then 2 defensive mods. Now, if you don't have LP Mortality's Grasp, don't worry. You don't exactly need the crit or the area from this for the build to feel good. What you do need is a source of armor shred. And since you are using uniques, if you don't have armor shred on your gloves, you need to grab them on your amulet. You only want one source of armor shred because this build hits so fast, but you can get it from your amulet if you don't have LP on your Mortality's Grasp. That covers kind of the basics of the build. Basically, this build has actually surprised me a lot. It is almost 700 corruption viable, and I'm still pushing it pretty far. This cycle kind of feels like bosses have a ginormous health bar. So despite the fact that with target dummy testing, this build has about 70% of lightning blast single target, it still takes a really long time to kill bosses. We're talking like a 2-minute timeline boss fight. So it's kind of normal, this cycle, unfortunately, but it's still within reason that you can do them, but it's not a crazy single target damage build. But it is incredibly tanky. When you have all of your buffs on, you should have close to 5,000 armor. So if I activate your Reaper form here, teleport, pretty close to 5,000 armor, which is pretty crazy considering we're not using any of the old tech with scaling Soul Feast to get tens of thousands of armor. But some closing remarks are really try and get your mana regen to the point where you can cast once per second purely based on your regen, whatever your cost is here. So if you're going to put a 4th point here, you should probably try and get to 27 mana per second, which is really, really hard to do. And what you'd have to do to reach that point is probably either not run Red Rings of Illyria, or you run them with Exalted mana regen on them, and then you probably also have to add some Exalted mana regen rolls on your belt and on your amulet. Apart from that, it's damn near impossible to scale much more than 24 mana per second. Now, you can drop points into your mana regen node here as long as you don't drop below that threshold of 1 cast per second from regen. That's where it starts to feel reasonably comfortable to spam your skill. Now, this is a very low button count build, but the one scary thing you have to take into consideration is how Reaper form works. So if you either let it drain, so you take a long time to go from one set of enemies to another and your leech runs out, or you get hit so hard that you lose all your life but you don't die, Reaper form will drop. In either case, you're going to lose a lot of your damage and a large amount of armor. So you have to play a little bit more carefully once that happens. Now, there's a chance that you get hit so hard that you just die despite being in Reaper form. And that's basically because the hit did so much damage that it went through your Reaper form health bar and the human health bar that you would have had, because Reaper form will take the amount that it went below your health while you're in Reaper form and subtract it from how much health it's going to put you up. And if that goes below your maximum health when you're going to be in human form, then you just die. That's one of the main problems with Lich, and it's part of why I don't run Death Seal on this build, because there's not a skill specialty slot for it, but also as soon as Reaper form or Death Seal or both run out, you lose all of your defenses and a large amount of your damage, and Lich starts to feel really bad when you don't have both of these up. But this build feels pretty consistent to play, and it's pushed to a very respectable solo corruption level. So, anyway, that's the build.